today we're talking about housing affordability. Housing affordability, how did we get here? Where do we go? And I'll talk about it in three parts. And I will gloss over some of these relatively quickly because it is such a broad topic, but I'll make the slides available as well. And I think the first thing to do is to think about when we're talking about housing affordability, what exactly do we mean? What is the problem we are trying to solve? Because there are a range of different problems. And depending on how much you think you can throw the whole system up in the air and sort of remake it from scratch, some of these problems may not seem to be problems at all if you think of a different way of thinking about housing tenure in Australia. But I'm relatively sceptical we're going to move away from a world of home ownership, unfortunately, because I think that is just the world in which we live. So we'll talk about the fact that home ownership is declining, especially amongst the young and the poor, how low-income earners are struggling to afford housing, how the whole story is widening the gap between rich and poor, which is the theme of tonight's presentation. And then also the fact that homelessness is on the rise. I'll talk very briefly about how we got here and then about how we can actually solve the problems. Now, you can sort of break down the solutions into solutions that are about fixing the housing market, because I think that is in some ways broken. And then there are things that are about helping low-income earners in particular to be able to access safe, secure and affordable housing. And there are various levers that we can use there. So look, where are we? This is just since COVID. This is just showing the incredible rise in house prices in the last couple of years, which is on top of the incredible rise in house prices over the course of recent decades. And so we're in a world today where house prices on average is something like 6, 7, 8, 9 times median incomes across Australia, compared to a world where 3 decades ago they were 2 to 3 times. COVID has turbocharged this. And, a lot of this is interest rates, but there are also just the fact that there's just been an incredible increase in house prices in recent decades. Now, that's a big problem because if you're thinking about affordability, and about access to home ownership. And home ownership is the bedrock of how people access housing in Australia. We are in a world where home ownership rates are in the mid 70%. Those rates will fall, but I'm not sure we're going to get to a world where home ownership rates ever fall below half the population. And if that's the case, then those that do own their own homes are likely to remain in a world where they think home ownership is a good thing, and policy to a fair degree is probably going to think of home ownership as a good thing. Although if house prices fall 20% in the next couple of years, that may get some people to reassess the benefits of home ownership. And so if you're thinking about who can't access housing, it's at the moment, if you were talking about home ownership, it's that those that can't access the deposit. It's those that don't have access to the bank of mum and dad. They can often afford the repayments, but they can't get the deposit together. And that's leading to a growing gap between the housing haves and the have-nots. And you can see that in who owns homes in Australia today. So this is showing you for each age group, so 25 to 34s here on the left, then 35 to 44-year-olds, so going older as we go right. From the poorest 20% is the first quintile to the wealthiest 20% by income for those age groups. And looking at rates of home ownership back in 1981, and then the most recent census in 2016. And what you can see is just the sheer collapse in home ownership, amongst younger Australians, but it's not all younger Australians. It's younger, poorer Australians, typically without access to the bank of mum and dad. And so it's hard to look at this and say this is just about millennials having different preferences for home ownership and that somehow that only emerges in a way that completely skews by income. It looks instead like affordability, accessibility of home ownership in Australia. And the issue is that those that don't own their own homes by the time they're in their 40s, they're increasingly the ones that are in their 50s and 60s not owning their own homes in retirement. And this is leading to a world where, look, if we think about income inequality in Australia, growth in incomes, in disposable incomes over the course of the last 15 years or so, this is only up to 2015-16, but I don't think the story changes that much going forward. Incomes at the bottom and incomes at the top have grown at relatively similar rates, except for the top 20%. It isn't that big a story. But incomes, when you account for housing costs, starts to look much more skewed. Those that don't own their own homes, those that are renting in particular, are spending more on housing. And therefore, when you think about their income after housing costs, you see much more of a skew. Then we look at wealth inequality. The increase in wealth because of housing, amongst other factors, of which super is frankly one of them as well. We are in a world where wealth inequality in particular, is on the rise. And that will in time transfer from a problem, become a worse problem as bequests are passed on to younger generations because older generations see substantially more wealth passed to them to younger generations. This is showing the average size of inheritances by the wealth quintile of the person that is receiving the money, of the wealth quintile they're in before they receive the money, from poorest to wealthiest. Now, the PC released a report recently that said, don't worry about this. It's going to result in a reduction in relative wealth inequality because poor people have so little that the little bit extra we give them is worth more to them than what those at the top get. But I would say in a world, if we're worried about social mobility, which is something I know Emma's going to talk about, the fact that the sheer absolute size of the increase in wealth that's going to flow to wealthier Australians, younger Australians, is going to make wealth inequality worse and make social mobility worse in Australia in the coming decades. The other issue is with falling home ownership, as I talked about before, that the falling home ownership amongst renters, amongst older Australians at the bottom, that means we're going to see more retired renters. And more retired renters means more retirees at substantial risk of living in poverty. Now, home ownership isn't a panacea that means you don't live in poverty. Like, it doesn't magically give you a whole bunch of extra wealth. That is, unless house prices rise substantially. But it does mean that you are in a much more vulnerable situation because if you're renting, you've got to put 30% plus of your income out of your own pockets to pay for housing. And we see that half of all single over 65s that live alone, so more than half, are living below the median poverty line of 50% of median income. And whereas if we're thinking about retirement generally, homeowners look like they're doing okay. Even homeowning pensioners are doing relatively better on financial stress measures than working age Australians who are in severe poverty in Australia, if they're renting. At the same time, rents have been rising so that rental stress is on the rise, particularly in our capital cities. So Australians are spending more, low-income Australians are spending more of their income on housing. And so that is meaning they have less left over for other things. And at the same time, falling rates of home ownership means that more Australians are living in private rental accommodation for a lot longer. And so while we should always care about tenancy laws and tenancy reform, even in a world when it was a smaller group of people living in private rental, in the world we're in now, where more people are going to be living in private rentals, going through the stage of having kids, having them go through childcare, having them go through schools, they're going to need more stability in their lives than what the current rental tenancy market offers them. And so we're going to have to change rental tenancy laws in quite substantial ways if we're going to offer the same security to renters that homeowners have. And so I said at the outset, I think one of the things I'm skeptical of is that we're going to change the great Australian dream of home ownership. So the best thing that we can do is to make renting on par with home ownership in its sources of security and the security it provides to renters and making sure that it is affordable. So if we think about how did we get here, I'll cover this very briefly because I think a lot of us know this story pretty well. Look, the most recent house price rises in particular, they are driven by the fact interest rates fell to record lows in Australia and around the world. And that is, if you look at the Reserve Bank's research, a 1 percentage point decline in interest rates from very low levels that they were pre-COVID is sufficient to see house prices rise by about 30%. And if you recall from the first chart, that is literally what we've seen across Australia, admittedly with much stronger rises in some cities, particularly cities like Adelaide, Brisbane and Perth, and smaller rises elsewhere, particularly in Melbourne. And so this is that RBA research. So if you have an increase in house price, in interest rates, you see a decline in house. You see a decline in interest rates, you see an increase in house price. The converse is obviously going to be true as well. But in the long term, a big driver of lower rate of high house prices has been structurally lower interest rates in Australia and around the world. Now, you could say to that, well, we should have higher interest rates. But in a world where you are also worried about full employment, it doesn't necessarily follow that just having artificially pushing up the interest rate, the RBA pushing up the cash rate in the period pre-COVID would have actually led to better outcomes. It potentially would have led to a world with more unemployment, and that's very costly, particularly for vulnerable people. But supply can also help. So if we look across countries, Australia is one of the very few countries, this is going in before COVID, so COVID does make a difference here, but before COVID, Australia saw some of the least increase in housing stock, this is the x-axis here, per adult aged 20 plus, that's the people that tend to form households, over the course of the last 25 years. And I think it's no coincidence they also saw some of the biggest house price rises above inflation over the same period. Whereas some of the countries that have done much better, say Japan, which obviously has had a stagnating population, but they have not had their population fall by 25% over that period. I think it's fallen something like 2% over that period. Most of what's happened is they've built substantially more housing per person. So more supply can help. And we haven't built that much supply in Australia in the last 20 years. If you think of COVID, people look at COVID and say, well, COVID's sort of the thing that proves that this is wrong, because we saw house prices explode even though we saw migration fall to zero. But I think what people are missing is the fact that while migration fell to zero, the average Australian decided that they wanted more space. They wanted a home office. They wanted to move to the regions. So the average household size actually fell. This only fell from just over 2.6 people per household. This is RBA data to, 2.57. That was still 130,000 extra households. That's roughly equivalent to a decline in population of 250,000 people, assuming household size of 2 people per household. And so even though you had a decline in migration, you still had the same increase in demand for housing as we would have otherwise seen. And that's partly why we're in the world today, while market rents, are rising at rates of 7, 8, 9, 10% across much of Australia. And so why haven't we got more housing in the long term? Well, it's because density in our cities really hasn't increased that much. This is showing you in 1981 and 2016, by distance from the General Post Office, the increase in population density over that time for Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, that's each of these bars, between 81 and 2016. And you can see, say, in Sydney, and to a lesser extent in Melbourne, big increases in population density close to the city, but much smaller increases in population density, particularly in Melbourne, once you get to 10 kilometres out from the city. So in the middle ring suburbs, we haven't seen a substantial increase in population in that time. And while we have seen an increase in demand for people moving to the regions, regional housing markets seem to have similar problems. And so when we've looked before at how well housed are Australians, how well are we offering people what they want, we actually find that in Australia, in Melbourne and Sydney, if you compare what the stock actually provides between, detached homes and then denser forms of housing in the orange and yellow, compared to what Australians want. And when we've done this work before, we haven't just asked you, would you like a 6-bedroom house in Kooyong with a tennis court and a butler's pantry? We've asked people to make real trade-offs. What sort of house do you want for a given price? Is it a detached house in the urban fringe, a townhouse in the middle suburb, or an apartment close to the city? And what we're finding is there's substantially more demand for denser forms of housing that's not being met. It's only gradually being met in the market. And the reason for that is that the planning system that makes it hard to build more housing reflects the interests of those that live in those areas already, particularly in Melbourne. If you're living in an area in the southeast, in the east, which are the more attractive, the better serviced areas in Melbourne, increasingly this is happening in the north, then the interests of the councils reflect the interests of those that live there already, and not those that would get a vote in council elections if more housing was built. And some of that is rational. People don't like their areas to change. This is from the Productivity Commission. Why don't you want to see more housing in your areas? More traffic congestion, more crowded public transport, loss of street appeal. These are real concerns. The trouble is that with the growing population, if the councils and the areas of our major cities that are the most attractive, where people most want to be, say, no, we prefer fewer people there, then you end up with them having to go somewhere else. They end up less well located. They end up further from amenities. And that's not in anyone's interest in the long run. The other thing that does drive house prices and rents, it is immigration. Look, it's worth noting it exists. This is a trade-off that exists, that with migration, the increase in migration in a world where we don't build more housing, then rents, according to Reserve Bank of Australia research, are 9% higher by 2018 than they otherwise would be if we continued in a world before 2005 where migration didn't increase. Now, this does not mean that Australians are worse off because rents have gone up 9%. It's a transfer within the Australian community from those that rent to those that own. So this is something we can ameliorate if we want strong migration. And we can do that by raising the rate of rent assistance and raising the transfers to make sure that low-income earners can continue to afford housing while also building more. And so what can we do about this? So I sort of focus on a couple of different levers, but here's kind of how we've mapped these in the past. This is every lever that we can think of that's really about making housing more market rate housing more affordable. Policies that are about redistributing income to low-income earners, which we support, don't fall on this list. This is showing you how big different policy levers would have, in our view, in making housing cheaper to rent or buy, going from left to right, and then how much of an impact they would have on the other dimensions that we care about. You know, what does it do to the federal budget position? What does it do to economic growth? What does it do to inequality? And then we rank them by how difficult or easy we think they are. And so it's unfortunately the case that most of the things that we think that would make the most difference are in the red, in the top right corner here, are about boosting density in the middle suburbs, building more housing. Tax reforms also matter too. So if you did abolish negative gearing, if we reform the capital gains tax discount, they would make a difference to housing affordability. They would reduce prices. But our assessment is if you did those two, it would only reduce prices by 2 or 3%. It is just not that big in a $10 trillion housing market. The size of those tax benefits do not explain how we have ended up where we are today. Instead, the main benefit is it unlocks a lot of money. The Greens took a policy to the election to basically reform the capital gains tax discount, change negative gearing. It was going to raise $60 billion for them over a decade. That's the benefit, more so than it makes housing substantially more affordable. Whereas the things that governments have tend to do are the things in the yellow: first-home buyers grants, try to push people to the regions. I do have shared equity on here, which is something we do support. And I note that it doesn't have a big impact on housing affordability, but that's because it's more about accessing home ownership, which is something we think is important, unfortunately, in the world in which we live, because of the preferential treatment the home has in the assets test. Now, I'm conscious of time, so I'll jump through a couple of these. So the first thing we can do is we can build more housing. That would do a lot to actually make housing more affordable in our major cities. We haven't built enough housing to meet the needs of a growing population. Grattan's estimates are if we could increase housing construction by 50,000 homes a year in the long term, that's a 25% increase. Then over the course of a decade, you would see house prices and rents fall by something like 10 to 20%. But at the same time, low-income earners can't afford housing because their incomes are too low. And then there are others that face big barriers to accessing housing. So when we think about boosting housing supply, we do find that it would increase affordability at the bottom end, not just in the middle. If you build more housing, it will lead to more renters having cheaper rents. In fact, our estimate is if you did build more housing and you saw a decrease in rents, those decreases in rents are equivalent to a substantial increase in Commonwealth rent assistance. So a 10% decrease in rents for the bottom 40% of income earners is worth about $1.5 billion. That's roughly a 40% increase in rent assistance. So it's not something to sniff at. Rent assistance, though, has to be part of the story too. So in the short term, rent assistance, in our view, is the most effective way to try to help low-income earners. It helps everyone at once. So you're immediately doing it rather than requiring social housing to be built over the course of 10, 20 years. And it is effective. It largely goes to low-income earners. And the evidence says that the impact on rents that is passed on to landlords is pretty small. You know, New Zealand research puts it I think it's about 10 to 15%. Recent Australian research says for rental markets overall, it's pretty small. It's a bit higher for low-income renters. But that would be the number one way we would go about it. But tenancy laws also are weighted in Australia in favour of landlords over tenants. So you can see on things like the typical lease term, we're talking about 12 months. Notice period for landlords, we're talking about 30 days, hasn't changed much. No fault or no cause lease evictions are a big thing in Australia. And so Australians can't make their house their home, and that's something that's got to change. A big part of that, though, is the fact that mum and dad investors are our landlords, and mum and dad investors are actually pretty bad landlords. You are not going to see, in my view, substantial improvements in tenancy laws and tenancy reform until you have more institutions owning housing, whether that be private, government, or not-for-profit. And it's because if you only own one property and it's worth an enormous share of your wealth and therefore your lifetime income, you are terrified that that person potentially is going to be a bad tenant. And so it's a zero-sum game between tenants and landlords. So we would like to move to a world where rental properties are owned by those other than mum and dad investors. And then finally, Australia's social housing stock is in decline. It has never housed most low-income earners in Australia. We are not the UK. We do not have 20-25% of our housing stock in social housing. So it has always been a residual. But we do need more, because without more social housing, we end up in a world where there is no new stock available for people who are desperately in bad situations in their lives, because people stay for a long time. Now, we know it's very effective in reducing homelessness. So I'll jump on from that. And so Labor has made a proposal here. They've made progress here. This is something that was partly based on Grattan's work to create a social housing future fund. The priority now has got to be to expand that fund, to build more social housing, and to require matching contributions from the states. Look, I'm going to stop there just for the interest of time, and so we can go on to Emma as well. Thank you.